On this episode of Doing the Most, we're talking about 10 tips, tricks, and hacks for home brewing.
Homemade brews and various how-tos, everything from mead to roast, bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
Many people came to our channel through our tips, tricks, and hacks videos, and we like to put them out once or twice a year. And what better time than now to talk through 10 tips, tricks, and hacks that will help improve your home brewing. Number 1, swirl your carboy for faster draining. This one's fairly simple, and you may have seen this around the web before, but if you swirl your carboy when draining, say, Starzan or hot water out of it, it will help drain faster because it will remove the vacuum effect when you're glugging liquid out of a carboy, because you'll have a straight tube of air going all the way through the carboy, and it will spiral right out of the jug at increased speed. For something like a 3-gallon carboy, that's not too heavy to lift, but still something that you might want to turn upside down and drain, this can shave a few valuable seconds off of your brew day. Number 2, don't fret over racking and bottling losses. This is one that I had to learn early on because sometimes when you use a high fruit load, you're going to end up having a lot of stuff left over at the bottom of your jug. And some folks will try and cold crash that or run it through a cheesecloth, stuff like that, to try and get every last ounce of alcohol out of their brew. And I get it. We spend a lot of time and energy and pour a lot of love into making this stuff. But sometimes you're just going to have losses. And just consider it the angel's share. Every batch you're going to lose a little bit, and it's not worth fussing over or stressing out over. Just accept it and be happy with the bottles that you get. But of course, cold crashing and finding agents, stuff like that, can help you get every last bit you can out of that carboy. Number 3, mill your grain into a bag over a bucket for brewing a bag. You've probably seen my setup where I have my grain mill attached to a bucket lid so I can mill my grain directly into the bucket. But pro tip, if you're doing brew in a bag, lay that brew bag inside the bucket, drape it over the outside, and then mill, and you'll be milling your grain directly into the bag that you're going to be brewing with. Easy peasy. Number 4, remove fruit bags before primary finishes. Now this does not go for every brew, but this is something that I kind of relearned in our series doing Jack Keller's wines, which is to pull the fruit bag out before the wine is finished. That way, any oxygen that you're introducing while you're draining that bag will likely get consumed by the yeast as they're finishing up fermentation. Again, this doesn't apply to all kinds of brews, but it does apply to certain kinds of brews like some fruit wines or fruited ciders, where you can rely on the protective factor of fermentation finishing up to help protect you from oxidization in your brew. Number 5, use cider to test how fruit comes through in secondary. Cider is very cheap to make. I almost exclusively make it with grocery store apple juice. It can be done, and it can be done great. And cider provides a really great blank canvas for testing adjuncts, and specifically for testing fruit. And so when I'm trying to figure out how a fruit might work in secondary in something like a mead, like a hydromel, before I spend good money on honey and go through that whole process, sometimes it's okay to make a 1 or 2 gallon batch of fruited cider to see how that fruit plays in secondary. And it helps you decide if you're using too much fruit, too little fruit, the right amount of fruit before you move on to a brew where you're investing more of your time and resources. Number 6, airlock blow off. So basically what I'm talking about here is using an airlock, like this 3-piece airlock, and a piece of tubing with a larger inner diameter. And you can place that ever so carefully over that center column and use that as your blow-off tube. It gives you a much larger diameter, so it's less likely to be encumbered by stuff. And all of this is already meant to go into a carboy, so you don't have to try and rig something up that's going to go into the bung, some kind of solution like that. If you can find a piece of this larger tubing, which is probably available at your local brew shop, you can use that to make your blow-off tube. And when you're done with it, you can simply pop the tubing off and switch back to using it as a regular airlock. Number 7, PARTI-GYLE. This is a way to get the most out of your grains when you're brewing beer. So say you brew up a beer and you've mashed your grains, you've drained that mash off to become wort, and you're boiling that away to make a beer. But you have all these leftover grains. Well, if you don't sparge, meaning you don't wash all of the remaining sugars out, you only carry the sugars that have drained out from the grain, you can use the remaining sugars in that grain, as well as throwing in maybe some other specialty grains to create a second beer from the same grains. Now, you might be trading off ABV in your first beer, but you're getting a second run of beer, possibly a smaller amount, but a second run of beer out of those same grains, making your grain dollar stretch a little bit farther. I am planning an upcoming video at some point on PARTI-GYLE beer brewing, but there are videos out there on YouTube about the process, and I would encourage you to go take a look. Number 8, top crop for a yeast starter. So say you're making a couple of very similar brews and you're doing that within the same week's time. Some yeasts, particularly a lot of different ale yeasts, are good for top cropping to harvest yeast. So what that means is you would brew something up with a good yeast for top cropping, and when the time comes, maybe 2 or 3 days later, as you start to get to high krausen, when all the foam is rising to the top, that's carrying up a lot of healthy yeast. And you can just go in with a sanitized implement and scoop off the top and use that as your starter for your second brew, basically making your yeast dollar stretch twice as far. I'll put a link in the description to some of the yeasts that are really good for top cropping. You may have heard of yeast washing. We have a couple of videos on that. This is not that process. You're literally scooping yeast off the top of your brew and then pitching that as your yeast for your next brew. Why not use your current brew as a yeast starter for your next brew, as long as you don't have a lot of big flavors that might carry over from one brew to the next? Number 9, take gravity readings after back sweetening. So if you're like me, you might like to back sweeten your ciders or meads or wines to taste. But say you're gonna make that again next month or next year, and you really like where it landed. It's good to take a hydrometer reading before back sweetening and after back sweetening, and make a note of where you back sweetened to and how you did that. So that way, the next time you're trying to replicate that recipe, you know exactly where to back sweeten to on your hydrometer to make it an identical back sweetening experience. Gravity readings are not just for checking your status of fermentation, they can help you balance your brews as well. And finally, number 10, save bold honey for back sweetening. And this is mostly when it's a question of expense. So say you wanted to make a traditional mead with something like meadow foam honey or Tupelo honey, something that's got a big, bold presence, but you don't really have the budget to go all out on your honey in primary. You maybe don't want to buy 12 or 15 gallons of meadow foam honey for a mead. A great way to simulate that experience would be to brew the mead with a neutral honey, like a clover honey or something neutral to bold like an alfalfa honey, and then back sweeten with that more expensive and rarer honey. So maybe you would use 13 or 14 pounds of clover honey in primary for a 5-gallon traditional mead, and then back sweeten with 1 or 2 pounds of meadow foam honey to add back some of that nice rich vanilla marshmallowy flavor without going all out in the expense department. It's not a perfect solution, but it's a nice intermediary step between going all out and saving a few bucks. If you like this video, I hope you will subscribe if you haven't already and ring that notification bell so you don't miss any of our upcoming content. And of course, there are a few different ways to connect with us in the Doing the Most community on the web. Until next time, happy brewing and cheers.